click on our, I'm trying to just find where we can go with this. Here we go. I'm going to hit start. Here's my, I click on load stock. I'm going to pick two of them. Well, otherwise it'd be too long. So let's go this guy and this guy. Say open. And here we are in file OK. Now, I'm a little bit a stickler for this thing here. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here so that we can get exactly what we're doing, start it all over again because I want to see step by step. Okay, I'm going to click on load stock. Boom, I get an event. I am now in the button one click. That simply says, oh, you want to select the stock? Let's open the file dialog. So I'm going to tell it, go ahead, continue. It opens the file dialog. I select 1, 2 stocks, and when I say open, that's going to tell it, hey, we've selected a stock. Let's go ahead and take care of it. Now notice that all that we do now in open file dialog is when we have the file OK, we say we just need to go through every single file name, and for every single file name, I'm going to create a new display form, okay? And I'm going to pass it the file name, the date, time, pickers, the start, and the end date. That's going to give me a new form. That's it. I'm just going to create a new form. But this is the constructor is going to do more than just create the form. We will want to do all the stuff such as, hey, I know the file name, so let me go read the stock, let me go reverse it if necessary, let me filter it, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, let me even tell the form, you're ready, show yourself to the world. So I really don't have to do anything else after I create the form. I don't have to say, for instance, to the form, show yourself, because I can have the constructor, when everything is done, tell the form, now you can show yourself. So really, the code at this point that you modified from your, let's say, first project is instead of just displaying stuff in the starting form, you create a new form, but that new form needs to know what the file name is and what the start and end dates are. And once you've created the form, everything should be done. So now if I decide to go and say, well, let's go in, see what happens. Well, it's doing this part here, but here we are in the constructor. And again, whenever you construct something that is derived from form, the first thing you have to do, always do, is initialize component. If you look at the default constructor that Visual Designer, that the .NET Framework gives you, notice how when we were doing the default construction, what we did right away was go initialize the component. Then there was nothing else to do, but you always have to do that. If you don't do that, the form will not have set up all of its components. In fact, if you were to go into that very quickly, so if I step, and now I'm at initialize component, it is an initialized component that you see that, oh, that's where it instantiates each one of the control, like here. I mean, if you look at it, you will see that in the form at the bottom of it, did we go to that part? No, not for this. That at the bottom of the form, it declares all the variables, so you can see all the controls. Say, oh yeah, this is our refresh button, this is our start date, end date for the date time pickers. We have a couple of labels, and we also have our chart object. So all these things are declared to be part of the form object, but when you go into initialize component, which is right here, it says, okay, I have my variables, but the fact that you declare the button does not mean that that button exists. It's just a reference, so there's just a pointer which will be null. As a matter of fact, if I look at chart area, even though I've declared all these variables again at the bottom, I can look at them here. What's the button refresh? It's null. What's the start date? Null. End date? Null. Start label? Null. End label? Null. Chart? Null. All of these are nulls, okay? Not until you initialize component, you start putting things in them, will they become something, or will they refer to something. And you can see right off the bat, the first thing that we do, we create a new chart area. So if I step over it, boom, I have a new chart area. If I look, it hasn't been set equal to it yet. So here we are. By this time, now chart area 1 has some value in it. If I step over, chart area 2 now has a value. If I look at the series, they're both null. Well, it has to instantiate the series. Here's series 1, now series 1 is some series. Now if you look at it, it's a series with no data in it. It doesn't even know what chart area it's connected to, but you instantiate the object. So initialize component does that for series 2. There's a button refresh right here, which is null. Well, we instantiate a new button. So now refresh is a new button, okay? And the same happens to all of these components, okay? They are all instantiated, but after being instantiated, we take care of some layout stuff. We say, don't display anything. We're not done yet for displaying. Now we say, hey, we had said that there is a button refresh. Not only that, we just instantiated the button refresh, but the properties are not set yet. In fact, if I look and I ask, what's the location of the button? It says 0, 0. That tells you something, that when you instantiate a button with the default constructor, notice how all these guys that we are instantiating, we're instantiating them with no argument on the constructor. So we're calling the default constructor of every component on the form. Do we see that? So now you might want to say to yourself, when I instantiate a button, I say, give me a new button. Well, what are the values of its position? What is its size? Well, you can take a look at it here, because button refresh right here, I can click on it and I can go and look. For instance, I can say, what's the bottom of it? It's at 23. Like here, what's the size? The client size, it's 75 by 23. What's the client rectangle? 75 by 23. What are the bounds? So you can see what those values are. You might be interested in what's the location. If I create a brand new button, okay, I would like to know what is the location of that button. Well, the location is at 0, 0. So if you were to instantiate a button by default and then ask that it be displayed, it would be displayed in the upper left corner of the window. If I had 10 buttons and I say instantiate button 1, button 2, button 3, button 4, they would all have the same location of 0, 0, and they would all be sitting on one on top of another in the upper left corner. However, one of the things we did, okay, is we took the button, we put it down, and let me explain something. All of this stuff you would have had to write yourself if you didn't have a Visual Studio type development environment. You understand? You would have the class form. You would say, oh, my class form is derived from form. Okay, you would see that from over here. This says partial class, so you'd have to go to the definition of it, the other definition, which is over here. That other definition says, yes, my class form display, is derived from form. You would be typing that. And then what you would do is in the other form chart display, so this guy here, okay, in this other part of the class definition, you would say, here are all the variables I have. You would be typing that. In your mind's eye, you say, yeah, I'm going to need a button. Okay, I'm going to call the refresh. I'm going to need 2 date time tickers. You would be typing out lines 147 and 148. All the variables that in your mind you'd say, I'm going to need all these controls, you would be typing that. Do we see that? That's what we would be doing ourselves. Okay, and there's nothing complicated here. We said the form is derived, our form 1 is derived from form, and here are all the controls I want in that form. If you have a few variables, member variables that you want in the form for yourself, like, oh, I'm going to need a member variable to hold my, how do you call that? To hold my file path, my candlesticks, my stock reader, all that jazz, you could actually, you would actually be typing that information. Then you would say, hey, I need a constructor, okay? You would write a constructor, okay? And you would say, hey, no matter what constructor I have, whether it's a default constructor or a constructor that takes parameters, okay, what I would need to do is I'm gonna have to go initialize all these controls. So every single constructor that you create should first have this initialize component, which is where you instantiate each one of your controls, okay? So you instantiate the chart areas, the series, the buttons, the date time pickers, all of these things, you have to instantiate them. And once you've instantiated them, you've got to go and set their properties to whatever you want, because you know that when you instantiate a button, it's located at 0, 0. It's got a default size of 73 by 25 or 75 by 23, something like that, and so on. You say, well, that's not where I want my stuff. So for instance, for the refresh button, here it is. You know, you say, oh, I want the location to be 534, 643. I want the margins to be that. I want its name, the variable name, to be button refresh. I want the size to be 112 by 35. I want its tab index to be 1. I want the text on it to be refreshed and everything. All of this is there. And that bottom one, that last one is, I want the event handlers in case of a click from that button to be all the, you see the plus equal? This is a list of functions basically. So this is what is called a delegate. And if you're interested, you go read up on delegates, okay? The backbone of all this event-driven stuff. In any case, I can have a whole list of handlers. That means that when I click on the button, I not only call one particular function, but I may call 2, 3, 4 functions whose job is to say, oh, this button was clicked on. One function might make something happen, another function something else happen, but all in response to having clicked on that. And this is pretty much what you do for every control you have. Here we've just taken care of the refresh button. And now you say, how about the date time pickers? Well, the date time pickers, we want to write this code. And by the way, all of this code is nothing more than stuff you would have had written. And if you want to think of it differently, it's all a reading of your mind, okay? What this thing does now, it doesn't read your mind, not quite yet. It reads your movement. For instance, the moment I click on a button, okay, and I drop it on the form, what have I just done? I just told the designer, I'm gonna have a button. So it adds, just because you drop the button on the form, it adds this line saying there is a member variable that's gonna be a button, okay? So in a sense, stuff you would have had to type, it knows what in the real world you taking from the toolbox a button and dropping it on the form, it's equivalent to add this line to the thing. And if you were to go to the button and say, now remove it, it would know to remove this line. So now it's doing a higher level compilation. Instead of compiling a high level language to machine language, it's compiling movements that you make, take a button, drop it on the form, it's translating that into code. Do we see that perspective? It's a different way of looking at things, but sometimes that's what it takes to come up with these far ideas where you say, wow, you know, how did that person come up with this incredible idea? And you find out they're just like you, they just spent a bit more time thinking about stuff, and one day they stumbled on some different perspective that allows them to say, oh yeah, you're coding. By clicking on the button and dropping it on the form, you've just written some code. It's just that you didn't write it yourself, something else wrote it for you. Okay? Because essentially, by selecting a control from the toolbox and dropping it on the form, you're saying, I need one variable, or I need an object in my class that is going to be a button. Okay? So every control that you click and drop on the form means you're adding one of these lines. Okay? And when you've added the line, it also knows, hey, I need to have code that will initialize that particular control. Okay, and not only is it adding the line that you see at the bottom, it also adds the instantiation. You say, yeah, I'm gonna have a button refresh, but I need to instantiate it, and that's what this is. This creates an actual new button. So the moment you drop it on the thing, it knows you want that variable, it writes that variable name, and it also writes the code to say instantiate a button. Then it says, well, instantiating the button, especially, you don't know what kind of parameters, so what you do in default, you now have to establish where that button is so that all the buttons you put don't all end up with exactly the same property. And that's where now, what it does is it looks more closely at what you did. Yes, you did click and you dropped it. That created 2 lines of code. Make that a variable in the form and add an instantiation line when you say new button. But you didn't drop it here, or here, or here, or here. Exactly where you dropped it lets it know the location. That's how it's able to say the button's location is going to be wherever you actually dropped it. So it knows where you dropped it, so it knows what the location should be. Margin, there's some standard stuff on margin, but you could change that if you want. When we change the property for the name, and I always say, always name it button underscore blah, blah, blah. Well, now that writes that line of code. It sets that property, the name, which you can see in the panel, okay, to that. When you take the button and you make it bigger or smaller and so on, that's another line of code that it can now figure out what is the size of the button. And that's what that is, okay? Tab index, it's the first control you dropped on the form, that's tab index 1, okay? You took the button and under properties, you gave it some text to go on top of the button. That allows to write this line. There's a couple of visual standard stuff. If you want to change them, you can. And then when later on you added a click event handler, if you to add that click event handler, here it is, add this event handler, because this is an event handler, add it to the list of event handlers of the click event, okay? And then it does the same thing for all the other things. But essentially, all this code is written, it's really translating your movements, you know, how you make something bigger, smaller, how you drop it here rather than here, translating all of that. Later in the future, you'll, as a programmer, well, either AI will be taking care of things for you, or an intermediate stage, you'll have a helmet, you'll put it on, and in your mind's eye, you'll be imagining yourself grabbing, you know, a button, putting it somewhere, and at the same time, something will interpret what you're thinking, and you'll see your code be creating. So this thing will now literally read your mind to write code, or read your mind to send that what you want to do to some AI thing that will then write the code and compile it and run it. You're lucky. I may not see that, but you will. And depending on how well you do now, you'll be participating in that revolution, or you'll be the ones thrown out because, well, you don't know the stuff. Okay? But it's a fascinating world coming along. I hope to see it. I hope to help build it. All right, so that's what our code here does. We initialize a component, and remember, this is the constructor that takes 3 parameters. Now, I have a stock reader, which we don't need. I'm talking to someone who came to see me this morning. But what we want to do with the information that we're given, I'm going to save that original file path, which is the file name of the stock that we want. I'm saving that. I actually have in my chart display, which is this guy here. If you look up, I do have a variable called file path. I have another variable called candlesticks, which is meant to hold my entire list of candlesticks. And I have stock reader, which I don't necessarily need if my stock reader has a static function. But let's not worry about that for now. Okay. So what we're doing, I'm going to step over. I save my file path. And the start date and end date that I'm given in the constructor, where am I saving that information? I'm putting it directly into my date-time pickers. Why? Because if you look at your project number 1, you probably see that your filter function, what did your filter function need? It needed the 2 dates. And where did it get the 2 dates? From the 2 date-time pickers. That's what. So if you want your load picker to work, it's not a function that you pass the start and end date to. It's a function that needs to get them from the 2 date-time pickers. That's why I set my 2 date-time pickers to have the information we want. Okay, once I've told my new form, because remember, I'm constructing my form right now. I've initialized the components, And what I'm doing here, I'm saving the file name and the start and end date. I can now ask that new form, okay, at construction time to go load and do other things. So if I say load, I simply say load and display. I say the text. I'm going to set up the text of the form to the file path, which I've saved. I'm going to tell go load the candlestick. We know about that, and because we have the file path, we can just say go load the ticker. Now, what does load the ticker do? It's a bit more than just loading, as I have in mind. Yours may be a bit different, but what you're doing, you tell the stock reader to read the candlestick, okay? Once you got your candlestick, you grab the first two candlesticks because you're gonna check on their date. That's gonna allow you to decide whether you should reverse the list or not. So essentially, again, on line 43, I go read the entire list of data. And then the next lines up into the if. I'm reversing the list if necessary. Once I've done that with loading the ticker, I can step out of it. And then, okay, I'm gonna now say, I've got my entire list of data, let me go display the stock. So load ticker, all it does, it loads the entire stock history for that particular stock. Then display the stock is where we do a few things. In fact, here's all of it. You filter. Now, when you filter, you're gonna need those two dates, the start and end. Look at where it gets them. It gets them from the date time picker, the start date value, the end date value. Therefore, those two things have to be set. That's why before we do all that, the two dates that were passed, we send them to the two date time pickers. That way, the display stock function can filter. Once it has filtered, it can normalize. Now this is over here. And once I filtered, look at that. My candlesticks, I had read 130 of them, but my list of filtered candlestick only has 9. So yeah, we went from 190 candlestick, which is the entire file, to just 9, which is for the two dates that I specified, okay? Then what we do, we set up, okay, now we do the normalization. I'll have to go through that again. And once we've normalized, we simply say, go ahead, set up the data source to be the list of candlesticks, bind the chart, and then show the chart. Once we've done that, we are pretty much going to be done. Okay, we are back in the constructor, and at the end of the constructor, we say, we've done everything, the form is ready to be shown to the world, and you ask the form at the end of the construction, this is a method of the form, you say to the form, show, which is basically, show yourself. Because until now, it wasn't shown. It was just an object in memory that you were setting values to, okay? Just like if you say integer x equals 5, does that put a 5 on the screen or anything? No, it doesn't. It's just a variable in memory with a value of 5. Well, up to now, we haven't executed line 37 yet, but up to now, we just constructed in memory this form object, which has a whole bunch of components and so forth. But once everything is done, that's when we can tell it, go ahead, show yourself. So I say show. And then once we've done that, that was the constructor. We're done with the constructor for this particular form. And then it goes and it asks, what's the next form? And it does the same thing. It goes ahead, it creates a new form, passing it the file name, so that this is the stock you're gonna have to go read now, another one. And here's the start and end date. And when it's done with all of that, it's gonna show that chart. So right there, it's initializing the component, it's saving the information on the new chart, so what the file path is for that new stock, and what the start and end dates are, load and display. Okay, we do all of that. And when we're done, we're going to, again, do this, let me step out of all that jazz, step out of that. Now we're back into load and display. We display the stock, that means we set everything up in the chart, and then now the form is filled. We can now tell the form, everything is ready to go, show yourself, okay? And let's say continue, boom, it shows itself. And if I look, I can see that now I have 2 new charts that were created. I can look at each and every one of them, okay? And what their data is. So there's this guy. Did I just close one? Yeah. So, and that's that. So if I were to now run this thing without the debugger, and I were to say load a stock, but this time I'm being greedy and I don't know, I picked like 10 of them. I do this, it's giving me all that. I can go look at all my stocks, and if you can see, it tells you here are all the windows that you have. You can go click on any one of them of your stocks. So now you can look at multiple stocks. Okay, so I wanted to be a bit further than that, so we have 1 minute. Here's what the rest of project 2 is going to be. You are going to have to learn to identify which candlesticks are peaks and which ones are valleys. The definitions are pretty simple. If you want to know what a peak is, okay, just look at any stock, and would you be able to see over here that this is, for instance, a valley? Why do I call that? Because the low is lower than either low on either side. That's all that a valley is. A peak, for instance, this would be a peak. The high of this guy is higher than this high and higher than the one on, okay, makes sense? So those might be things you might want to add to your candlestick, because now when you look at each candlestick, you might want to specify, is it a peak? Is it a valley? Is it none? Is it both? You could be both, okay? And someone say, how can I be both a peak and a valley? Well, imagine the following scenario. You have a candlestick. Do you agree that that's a peak? Yes? Okay. And you agree that it's also a valley. So now in your candlestick, you might have 2 new variables, 2 Boolean variables, properties, one saying peak, one saying valley. Yes?
Are we displaying this somehow, like whether it's
Yes,
valley?
you will be displaying information, because once we know about peaks and valleys, we're going to talk about something called the waves. The waves are nothing more than something that goes from a peak to a valley, or from a valley to a peak, okay? For instance, you can see a wave here where I go from this valley to this peak, okay? The one thing is that not every valley is valid, or not every wave is valid. A wave is such that when you specify the extreme, the peak and the valley, or vice versa, the valley and the peak, do you agree that that specifies a low and a high for the wave? Yes? Okay. This is going to be the high, this is going to be the low. For this wave here, this is going to be the high, and this is going to be the low. The only restriction for a wave is that all the candlesticks that are inside the wave, they cannot pierce the top or pierce the bottom, okay? I mean, I could have had this. That's acceptable. But what if I had had this? Here's a peak, because, you know, it's the highest point. But, you know, my wave is this. That's a peak. But between this peak and this valley, there is a point where we had some candlestick that went above. Not acceptable. Similarly, I could have had a candlestick, some candlestick go below that. You can't have that. So now, you can already start thinking about, aha, when I receive all my candlestick, I can go to my candlestick and identify the one that are peaks and or valleys. Then, based on that, I can calculate all of my waves. I just have to find the pairs of peaks and valleys, or valleys and peaks, that have a valid wave. You will have to take that, put that maybe in a list, maybe put that in a tree, however you want to do it, okay? And then offer the user the availability to say, here are all the waves. If they click on a particular wave, you will want to show a line from the valley to the peak, or from the peak to the valley. You will want to show that. We will talk about that next week, about what we need to see. And essentially, that will be your project 2, to be able to do that kind of display, okay? All right.